call Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou kia ora. I think what the hundreds of thousands of students in New Zealand and overseas are hearing is this side of the House is going to take you seriously. This side of the House is going to be providing solutions to the $13 billion student loan debt. This House is going to support students because educated Kiwis is our future. But what those hundreds of thousands of students are also hearing is this government, this side, is more focused on those punitive gimmicks which we know aren't going to work, which are all going to be counterproductive. That's where National's focus is. Now, what we've seen under 5 years of National is the universities consistently slide down the international rankings. What we've seen is this government make tertiary education less accessible, less affordable, and in some cases downright impossible as they shut the doors to new students. It's not just the over 55, it's the capped enrolments, it's the IT sector, for example, who's crying out for new IT graduates. But this government says, no, we're going to cap your places in computer science. And instead what this government does is go, well, we're increasing all science places. Tell that to the IT sector, Mr Bennett, when people can study astronomy or wine science, but they can't get a place in computer science despite the industry calling out for it. So students and the tertiary sector knows National's no good. Sliding down the rankings, making studying less affordable, less accessible, and in some cases downright impossible. Mr Speaker, a lot of bills we see, particularly in the tax space or the tertiary education space, are kind of curate eggs. There's some good parts, some bad stuff, and you weigh up the pros and the cons of the legislation. This bill is an egregious, punitive bill. It's a bad bill, plain and simply. It's a gimmick. It's all about political spin. It's a waste of time. It's going to be counterproductive, and it ignores the solutions. I'm not trying to exaggerate. This is a bad bill that's not going to have the desired consequences. Remember back to Budget 2013, a forgettable budget, I'll give it that. But remember all the way back to Budget 2013. One of the headlines was that this government's going to get tough on student loan defaulters. This bill is simply serving a political purpose of Stephen Joyce to try and look tough on students. Because it's easy to beat up on students with student loans, particularly overseas students. It's easy for this government to pick a victim and do a bit of bullying, do a bit of beating for their own political objectives. Well, now we're seeing the consequences, because that political bullying tactics has to be ushered through this chamber, through law, as we're seeing today. So what we heard in the Select Committee was a chorus of opposition to this bill, because it's just not going to work. People know it's just going to be a gimmick. I mean, let's look. We're talking about 3.2% of the $13 billion student loan budget currently being held overseas. What we're seeing is a complete waste of police time. Now, this is what I'm and many of the submitters are particularly opposed to. We don't want to see the New Zealand police force act as, quite simply, debt collectors. What we heard is it's not just from the New Zealand Universities Student Association. We also heard it from the Treasury, and it's the Treasury who note this proposal may have the appearance of the police acting as debt collection agencies for the inland revenue. Because that's the heart of this bill. Quite simply, all the IRD has to do is request a warrant, an arrest warrant from the police to get detainees arrested at the airport. It's a bad look for the police, who don't want to be looking as debt collecting agencies. They want to be protecting us with the security of our border and security of our people. They don't want to be running around our airports trying to find student loan defaulters. It's not going to work. It's going to be a waste of time. And this is what we heard on the Select Committee. What we heard in the regulatory impact assessment, this bill writes, the impact of this policy on the compliance of overseas-based borrowers is uncertain, and they do not expect the faster recovery of loans from compliant borrowers under this proposal to generate any savings in the short term. No evidence is going to work. In fact, counter evidence that it won't work. What we know is New Zealanders are going to feel uncertain about returning home to New Zealand. They're going to try and avoid it. And I think what we're entirely going to see is the perverse incentive. New Zealanders just aren't going to feel comfortable coming home. In fact, on Facebook, Mr Speaker, I had my best mate who lives in Manly in Sydney emailing me saying, has that law come through? Because I'm really worried about what's going to happen. I'm sure thousands of New Zealanders are having this experience where they're feeling uncertain. And he's a New Zealander with a loan who's repaying his obligations, as I understand it. But what your punitive approach has sent is that all New Zealanders, no matter what their situation, no matter what they're doing with their loan, doesn't feel comfortable, because your objective was simply for political gain, to scare those overseas borrowers for your own political gain. So Kiwis overseas with loans are concerned, they're worried about what's going to happen when they return home, and what we may just see is more people avoid repaying their loans, avoid going to the IRD to try and renegotiate, or simply stop paying off their loan. What we also know is the way the loans are being calculated and the repayments is inequitable, and that's exactly what the officials have advised us. They say this bill creates an inequity whereby two loan borrowers with the same loan balances may have different repayment obligations. Because we're going about the way the issue, and I believe it's a serious issue given the scale of the overseas loan total amount, but what we need to do is approach it smartly. Because this is the exact opposite of taking a smart approach, where you simply just pick a number and that's the repayment. It should be based on the person's earnable income overseas. Now, I asked the officials, why haven't our government been in discussions with particularly the UK and Australian governments, given we know that's where the bulk of these loan holders are based? Why haven't we had discussions with those governments who we have very friendly relations, tax agreements in effect right now? Why aren't we talking to them where those people could either calculate their earnings in those countries so we could have a fair, progressive loan repayment rate back to the IRD? Or in fact, why aren't we even starting discussions so that those loan holders could pay off their loans through the other jurisdictions, PAYE or other tax systems that they have? Now, the fact is, what I heard was that they said, well, we don't think it's ever going to happen, it's too hard, so we haven't bothered. Mr. Speaker, what we need is some political leadership on solutions, smart solutions, which aren't these sort of broad brush, I hate to say the word dumb, but it's incredibly dumb to just pick a figure and say that's what everyone has to pay. It creates this inequitable solution. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to also touch on the increase of the loan repayment threshold, $45,000, and what the officials have pointed out in the regulatory impact assessment is that there's a risk that some previously compliant borrowers with balances greater than the $45,000 will simply stop repaying their loans. So you have this chorus of opposition, not just from the public and the student bodies, but also in terms of logic and common sense from the officials, because when they look at this, they know it's just simply a political gimmick. It's not going to work. What we need to do is be focusing on the solutions to reduce that $13 billion millstone around students in New Zealand and around the world neck. What we need to focus on is tax agreements with those other governments, as I talked about. We need to have a more open and flexible approach for overseas loan holders to renegotiate their loan and repayment obligations with the IRD. I understand it's easier for companies in tax avoidance and arrears to be able to renegotiate a loan than it is for a student loan holder. We need to provide these graduates with more flexibility. We even need to do simple things like make it easier for those overseas loan holders to be able to communicate with the IRD, be either online or over the phone. For example, many government departments run 0800 numbers, so people who maybe cannot afford the phone call are able to communicate with their government. Likewise, we could also investigate ways that maybe accessing an IRD website from overseas could be actually charged back to the IRD, similar likewise to an 0800 number. What we need to do is focus on incentives, carrots, not just this punitive stick-based political headline-grabbing approach. So what we need is those carrots, not those sticks, and this is what we're going to see as those student loan $13 billion reduce. We need a new approach to tertiary education which puts students front and centre, that listen to them, address their problems, address their challenges, because ultimately a New Zealand that's prosperous, a richer New Zealand, depends on educated Kiwis thriving. And what we're seeing is the student loan scheme across its history have an incredibly perverse outcome on New Zealand New Zealanders, New Zealand families, particularly New Zealand women, and it's high time, years and years after this loan was started, that we actually start addressing it smartly. We actually focus on solutions, carrots, not just sticks, and that's what you'll see on this side of the House this election, Mr Speaker. A real choice for students, a real choice for those 500,000 people with student loans in New Zealand.
Maggie.